Good morning, everyone. My name is Deb Uber. I am the Education Coordinator for the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center, and we are happy to have you all here this morning and are very pleased to bring you our webinar about Protestantism and embryo adoption. This morning, we have Daniel Nurbis joining us. Dan is the president of Nightlight Christian Adoptions and is an adoptive parent himself. He received a PhD in pastoral counseling and holds 3 degrees in theology, divinity, and ministry. Dan was also an ordained pastor and a professional Christian counselor, so we are very excited to have him sharing this morning about this subject. But before we get started, I am going to do a little bit of housekeeping. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation using the questions you submit through the Q&A feature. You may submit your questions at any time during the session, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, simply click on the Q&A panel on the lower right-hand portion of the screen. Type your question into the dialog box and click the send button. If you happen to be in the full screen view, you can click on the question mark icon on the toolbar in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. This will open the Q&A panel on your screen only. When you submit your question, it will be visible to all of the panelists, but not visible to the other attendees. We expect the presentation to last approximately 45 minutes with 15 minutes for questions, and we will be distributing a copy of today's presentation, as well as a list of answers to any questions submitted today during the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please contact WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. And just as a reminder, the presentation is being recorded today, so I will go ahead. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Deb, and thanks everyone else for joining us. And it's my pleasure to speak about Protestants and embryo adoption. The phrase embryo adoption is where we'll start. It is a controversial phrase in itself, and it's for a variety of very different reasons. So let me just first explain why we use the phrase embryo adoption rather than embryo donation, and why that phrase is controversial in the first place, for 2 different very groups and different reasons why they find it controversial. First of all, we use the phrase embryo adoption instead of donation because we recognize that there is a family raising a child not genetically related to them. And in our culture, we call that adoption. When you're raising a child that's genetically related to someone else, everybody calls that adoption. So it just seems like a rather obvious phrase. However, some rightfully recognize that our phrase embryo adoption is a pro-life statement in itself. And so the phrase embryo adoption has been associated with the pro-life movement, and it's been associated with the personhood movement, advocating for the personhood of embryos, advocating that people become people upon conception. Interestingly, there's a completely different reason that people find the word embryo adoption controversial, and it's because they see this as a medical procedure. You're giving genetic material to another family through a frozen embryo transfer that occurs in a medical facility, and so some say you shouldn't use the word adoption because this is a medical procedure. The reason we call it adoption, despite the personhood movement, for a completely separate reason, like I said, is that you're raising a child not related to you, but because the best practices of adoption are employed in this process. In other words, through embryo adoption, there's openness after the adoption where both families can contact each other. They know the outcome of the frozen embryo transfer, whether a baby was born. There's a home study usually involved in vetting the family and making sure they're educated and prepared and investigated in advance, that they're a suitable family to receive the embryo from the other family. And finally, there's a matching process where one family, the donor family, is able to choose who receives their embryos. So even if it weren't for the pro-life commitment that many embryo adoption agencies have, like Snowflakes at Nightlight, we would still use the word adoption because there is an adoption process with a home study, matching, and openness. But nevertheless, it's still accurate that embryo adoption is associated with the personhood movement. Let's go to the next slide. When we talk about who's involved then in that pro-life movement, I'll explain a little bit more about this later, but I think it's fair to say the pro-life movement has largely been led by Roman Catholics. Protestants have a commitment to the pro-life agenda. Many Protestants recognize the scriptural basis for life at conception and for defending the lives of the unborn or preborn. But when it comes to leadership, visible leadership, either at abortion facilities or in the media, Catholics tend to be the leaders in that area. Like I said, I'll explain a little bit about that later. Myself, I was born in 1974, the year after abortion was legalized. My wife was born in 1973, the year that it became legal. And in fact, my wife's mom was told by her doctor the year that abortion became legal. He said, well, you're kind of young. Maybe you ought to consider having an abortion because you're a little young to be starting your family, and this just became legal. Why don't you wait a couple years to have a child? And my wife is grateful that her mom didn't make that decision, and we look upon that story with surprise at how cavalier that was presented to my mother-in-law. Those of us born since 1974 have a different view of how the pro-life movement is led in this country than those who were a little bit older. I'm what's called a part of the survivor generation, where 1/3 of my generation since 1973 has been aborted. So 2/3 of those are survivors of the abortion movement since that time. In the early 70s and 80s, there was a more visible and mainstream organized pro-life movement that was regularly organizing and meeting at abortion facilities and then gaining media attention throughout the 70s and 80s. I think largely that has subsided. So it was during the 70s and 80s that there was a little bit more visibility from Catholics and Protestants at the same time in the same places with an organized movement to end abortion. Since many of us now are younger and can't remember or weren't around in those days, I think it's more clear now that the Protestant movement is less visible. It may be mainstream. I'm not going to say that Protestants are less committed to pro-life beliefs, but they're less organized in acting at abortion facilities, demonstrating, holding up signs, or even writing and preaching on the topic. Catholics are still a little bit more visible in that area, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. Let's go to the next slide. There are definitely notable Protestant pro-life writers and leaders. Francis Beckwith wrote the book Defending Life and makes the case against abortion, and then also the book by Dennis Horan, Edward Grant, Paige Cunningham about abortion and the Constitution. So there is a pro-life education movement, academic movement, as well as leadership, and it makes its way into the churches. But myself, I've been a pro-life organizer for 20 years, and I attended about 20 years ago an event that was in my area in Orange County, California, that every pastor in Orange County was invited. Now, Orange County has a population of about 2 million people, has thousands of churches. And I got a postcard that said there was going to be a pro-life pastor's lunch, and it was specifically geared toward Protestants. So Protestant pastor pro-life lunch. And I'm going to be honest, my motivation 20 years ago when I went to this was to hobnob with other pastors. I was a pastor for several years, and I thought, well, this would be a good chance to network and meet other people. When I arrived, there were 4 people at this lunch after every Protestant pastor had been invited. It was at that point that I recognized that even though the biblical case was well recognized for the pro-life movement by Protestants and that people had an intellectual assent to this idea, that the taking of those views into action was not happening, that people were unclear what they were to do next from taking belief into action. I heard Troy Newman, who's the director of Operation Rescue, speak at that lunch, and it was at that point that something really changed for me, that previously, like many Protestant pastors, I viewed abortion as one among a myriad of issues that people were asking to have face time in front of the church. People want to bring all kinds of issues to the church for action. There's homelessness, there's the issue of orphans in other countries, There's people within our own backyard in poverty. There's all kinds of issues that could come in front of the church. And like many pastors, I thought that abortion was an equal player among all the issues. I've got 52 Sundays a year. I can talk to people, and there's hundreds of issues. We're not going to be able to get to every single issue every time. So when am I supposed to give this issue its attention? It was at that point, at that lunch, where I realized there is one issue that does stand out among others. There's not necessarily a equal weight among all of these issues. We're in the midst of a culture that is no longer valuing life itself, and definitely a slippery slope. And I decided that this issue was a little more prominent than other issues we could pay attention to. So what I started doing was standing in front of Planned Parenthood facilities during 40 Days for Life, and it's there that I noticed that I was joined with many, many Catholic leaders, but not many Protestant leaders, not many Protestant church members or pastors. It was largely a Catholic audience. And furthermore, I noticed in those events that they made a difference. They changed people's minds, and that they reduced the number of people who were entering the facilities. Okay, let's go to the next slide. There are notable authors on the subject of embryo adoption as well, and here are some Protestant leaders. Russell Moore, who's the Dean of the School of Theology at Southern Baptist Seminary. He's an adoptive father, and he adopted from Africa 2 children, but in his book, Adopted for Life, he talks about embryo adoption as a moral imperative. And then Scott Ray, who's a distinguished professor of ethics at Biola University, wrote Outside the Womb. And what he says is that embryo adoption is a moral imperative, but IVF itself, the creation of those embryos, it's permissible but problematic at the same time. So this is where we see that Catholics and Protestants come to different conclusions on this issue, where many Catholics come to the conclusion that IVF is not permissible. Then some Protestant leaders say it's permissible though problematic. And then, of course, if Catholics start with the premise that IVF is not permissible, then they have difficult time sanctioning embryo adoption once they've already come to the conclusion that IVF wasn't permissible. For Protestants, if IVF is permissible, then embryo adoption becomes an imperative. And we'll explain a little bit more about why that is true. I think it's also important to note here that Russell Moore and Scott Ray both recognize that conception is defined as the meeting of a sperm and egg, and that's the point, that a person becomes a human being, and when a person then is endowed with the sanctity and rights of a human. So they advocate for the personhood of embryos upon conception when a sperm meets the egg. Okay, next slide. There's a key difference between Catholics and Protestants regarding the concept of human intervention in conception. For Catholics, they view this as a slippery slope, that if you allow birth control, then you also allow assisted reproductive technology, and then you're going to allow IVF, which then, of course, we would want to have embryo adoption, but they worry there's a slippery slope that people will play the part of God in the role of conception, and that will also, another key issue here is the separation of the bond of marriage when it comes to conception, that children are going to be conceived not by their mother and their father, but they're going to be conceived by either a mother and a donor or a father and a donor of one of the either sperm or the egg. And then that the Catholics view this as breaking the bond of marriage. I don't know that many Protestants have come to the conclusion that it's breaking the bond of marriage. There are some who have come to that conclusion. James Dobson, formerly from Focus on the Family, was adamantly against sperm and egg donation because of breaking the marital bond. But that doesn't mean he was against IVF or that he was against embryo adoption. So it's mainly in the donation of one of the gametes, the sperm or the egg, that marital bond is broken. So what I see in this area is that there's two ironies, whether it's a Catholic or a Protestant position. There's something ironic on both sides. Catholics are on the front line of the pro-life movement, and you may be wondering why we dedicated so much time just earlier in this webinar to talking about the pro-life movement, and it is pertinent. Catholics are on the front line of the pro-life movement, and yet they're not comfortable with embryo adoption. To me, this is ironic because embryo adoption is a statement and an advocacy of the personhood of embryos, which is related to the pro-life movement, and therefore those who are pro-life ought to be advocating for the life of every embryo, giving every embryo a chance. On the other hand, it's ironic that Protestants seem to be okay with embryo adoption. Most of the Protestant leaders who've written on this subject are not only okay with embryo adoption, but also IVF. And yet Protestants don't seem to be on the front line of the abortion issue. They're not on the front lines of advocating for the pro-life movement. So I'm not sure how to resolve or even explain that irony, but I think it's important to note. We can see that in this graph on this page, do Catholics, the question is who say that one can be a good Catholic without adhering to church teaching on a specific issue? And what we see is that Catholics do believe strongly, still, the vast majority, that they ought to follow the church's teaching on these issues, and that the Catholic Church has reservations, to say the least, if not prohibition on IVF, and that leads to at least some concern about embryo adoption because of, as I said, the slippery slope. If the Catholic argument is if we allow embryo adoption or if we encourage it, aren't we also encouraging IVF? And I think that's a very important question for Protestants to grapple with. So that's actually, maybe Protestants are not still grappling with whether we should allow birth control, but we should be grappling with whether embryo adoption encourages IVF. In fact, that's where Scott Ray comes to in his book when he says IVF is problematic, even if it's permissible. It is problematic, and we're going to look at some of the problems about IVF and the ethical issues it raises. And ultimately, we should be asking, are we encouraging IVF when we encourage embryo adoption? But I think it's too simplistic to say we shouldn't allow embryo adoption when it's actually the answer to the ethical issue rather than creating the issue itself. So let's go to the next slide. Let me explain what the issue is. The issue is, regarding assisted reproduction for Protestants, is the creation of excess embryos. This is what should be particularly troubling for any of us, especially with Protestants who recognize the life and personhood of embryos. Then if we create excess embryos, more than what the couple's going to use in their own IVF treatment, what are they going to do with those excess embryos? It's a moral imperative to only create embryos intended for implantation, and maybe not necessarily implantation by the genetic family, but the intent should be that every embryo created will have an opportunity of life. Not intentionally create more embryos than can or will be implanted, and that every embryo created will be implanted. So I think many Protestant leaders on this issue recognize these as the imperatives. Interestingly, last week I was speaking at a Protestant church. It was a Calvary chapel, and I was speaking about embryo adoption as well as adoption of children from other programs, our foster care program and international adoptions. And after the service, one of Nightlight's clients, they were a Snowflake client, came up to me and spoke and said, we've started the Snowflake process, but now we're having reservations. We're thinking of switching to international adoption. And I asked him, why are you thinking of switching? And he raised three issues that I think are very common among Protestants for concerns about embryo adoption. The first was that there are too many orphans already living throughout the world. With 168 million orphans worldwide, this gentleman was having trouble understanding why he would adopt an embryo rather than an orphan child from another country. And what I said to him is, you can. You do. People do. We have families who've done both. We have families who've adopted 2 children from China and 2 Snowflake children. We have a family who adopted a child from China, had a biological child, and then also adopted a Snowflake. So there's not a exclusion here. It's not an either or, it's a both and. There are some people who may be called to adopt internationally. God may have called some people to adopt embryos. God calls some people to do both. People have different visions and goals and purposes behind adoption. Some people who struggle with fertility want to experience the birth of a child. They're drawn toward embryo adoption. It doesn't have to be at the exclusion of many other people who are drawn to adopt internationally orphans from other countries for a different purpose. Incidentally, I did a survey of all of Nightlight's clients and determined that about half of those who adopt children internationally have a fertility issue. The other half don't. They have biological children and then choose to adopt internationally. Obviously, with embryo adoption, the rate of those who have a fertility issue is much higher, over 90%, that fertility is what's leading them. So really what we're talking about is two different groups of people anyway. The second issue that this gentleman brought to me who was thinking of switching was about too many embryos. He felt like it would be irresponsible to create too many embryos. And I would agree with him there, but that's, of course, what embryo adoption strives to answer. It gives an answer and a plan, a real plan to put in practice even before you make the decision to do IVF, that if you create too many embryos, these embryos will all have an opportunity for life. The last issue that he didn't bring up, but that many others do and should raise regarding this issue, is this too much loss overall. Even if every embryo is given a chance throughout the process of IVF, there will be embryos that don't survive that process. They won't even survive long after creation. Those that are created may not survive the freeze, they may not survive the thaw, they may not survive implantation, or even go to term. And so there is a lot of loss. Even if we do our ethical responsibility to give every embryo a chance, there will be many embryos who do not survive. And this, the IVF process does create life that then is fragile. So let's go to the next slide and I'll explain more about that. One issue less spoken about, less known about IVF is the loss associated with the creation of embryos. Despite our best efforts to implant every embryo, about half survive the thaw, and half survive implantation. So there's a 75% loss of life, even if we give every embryo a chance. Now we can commit to doing our duty to give every embryo an opportunity for life by implanting each of them. But the natural process involved here does result in loss. And so the ethical question that's raised is, should we go about creating life when we know it's going to be so fragile? Let's go to the next slide. Here is the main point that I believe Protestants and Catholics alike should be noticing and should be stating about the issue of embryo adoption. Embryo adoption seeks to solve a problem that already exists, not to create a problem. And that's what I said to this gentleman last week when he came up to me and said he was thinking of switching because of moral or ethical concerns. I said, we're not creating a problem here. You're not creating a problem by doing embryo adoption. You're solving a problem. These embryos have already been created. That's a given. And I think that's somewhat of a point that both Protestants and Catholics can agree on, is that despite the ethical teaching that either Catholics or Protestants have on the issue of IVF, the fact is people are creating embryos. Catholics are still creating embryos. Protestants are creating embryos. Both groups are doing it in large numbers, creating far more embryos than they need or will be able to use. And so what do we do about it? And what we should do is give these embryos an opportunity for life. So it seems to me that whether you believe in IVF or not, it's an ethical imperative that we allow and encourage embryo adoption. Let's go to the next slide. Here's my point on the matter. Embryo adoption is a moral imperative, not a neutral or gray area. Even if we admitted or came to the conclusion that IVF was not it was morally permissible or not permissible or somehow a gray area, despite that, embryo adoption is a moral imperative. So the purpose is to take the embryos that already exist, despite who created them, why they created them, whether they should have created them, and to give every opportunity for these embryos to come to life. Let's go to the next slide to see what the Bible says about this issue. Psalm 139, verse 13 through 14 says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." And Jeremiah 1:5 says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart." So we know that God sees us before not only before we're born, but even before we're conceived. And upon our conception, he sees us in our womb, acknowledges us as people, acknowledges us as part of his precious life and plan. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about our moral obligation. I think this goes back to my earlier slides about the pro-life movement as it relates not only to abortion, but to embryo adoption. Proverbs 24:11 through 12 says, "Rescue those being led away to death. Hold those staggering toward slaughter. If you say, 'But we knew nothing about this,' does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who guards your life know it? Will he not repay everyone according to what they have done?" And I think it's on this issue of respecting the sanctity of all human life, whether it's before birth, after birth, or upon death, the last couple of years of someone's life when they're terminally ill, whatever it is, we are called to not turn a blind eye and say, there's nothing we could do about it. When I have stood in front of Planned Parenthood facilities, people have agreed with what we're doing. They've given me the thumbs up, they've cheered, but they've said, well, it's already legal. There's nothing you can do about it. It's never going to be overturned in our generation. There's nothing we can do. But this verse says, don't say there's nothing. We knew nothing about this. Don't say there's nothing you can do about it. God knows whether we made an effort to rescue those who are being led to death. One time I was standing in front of a facility and a young man came up to me and said, wouldn't it be better for some of these children who are severely disabled not to be born? And the reason I bring this up is because some people doubt whether it even makes a difference when we act in these issues. What I said to him is my daughter, Natasha, who was born at she was adopted at the age of 2 by us, but when she was born with a condition called Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome, and her internal organs were outside of her body when she was born. And upon her birth, they put her internal organs back in, but she still had many persistent issues. She had a cleft palate, she needed a G-tube in order to eat, and it took a couple of years for her to be able to eat and drink normally, and a persistent speech problem afterward. But I think we all recognize that children who have their organs outside of their body, these are a pretty likely candidate for abortion. This is the type of person, when this young man said to me, wouldn't it be better for some of these kids not to be born? He's talking about my daughter. He's talking about Natasha. And she happened to be there with me that day. And I said, this is the type of person who people are talking about. And she's, of course, a wonderful, wonderful addition to our life and to the world. So I think that we have to recognize here, we're talking not just about a moral obligation, but also just an aesthetic. In other words, a word about beauty in our culture. We don't want to just adhere to our basic moral obligations. We want to live in a beautiful society. My father said to me several years ago that if he ever had Alzheimer's, he would want someone to just end his life, just shoot him. And what I realized when he said that is he's not only making a comment about himself. He may think he's making a comment that's very private about himself. But in reality, when he said that, he's actually making a comment about other people who have Alzheimer's. What he's saying is, I don't view the beauty and purpose and value of other people who have Alzheimer's. Their lives ought to end. To me, that is very troubling, that we would live in a society that doesn't that is so preoccupied with moral obligation without just taking a moment to think, what about the beauty of our society? Does not each person have beauty? Doesn't valuing each human life add to the beauty of our society and the way we treat one another? So I encourage us, and Protestants in my field, to look beyond moral obligation to the type of beautiful society we create when we value every human life. Let's go to the next slide. Embryo adoption is primarily set against stem cell research in ethical debates. And so for Protestants, it's not so much whether IVF ought to be allowed or whether even the embryos ought to be given a chance of life. Really what becomes the issue in mainstream society about embryo adoption is there might be something else we could do with these embryos. And some people argue that it offers an alternative for families who have remaining embryos. All other options would have resulted in the destruction of embryos. Well, some people say you could donate these embryos to science, to stem cell research, and then what you create is a ethical weighted argument rather than an absolute argument of should every embryo be given an opportunity for life. There are some who argue there are other things you can do with embryos and that those other things might have even more ethical value. So let's talk about what people can do with their embryos. Really, there's 4 choices that people have with embryos. They can offer them for adoption. That's the one that we've been talking about here. They can destroy their embryos. And amazingly, a lot of people feel more comfortable with that than any other option because, as I've spoken with people who call us on the phone, and I speak with potential embryo donor parents, they say, I just can't handle the fact of someone out there raising a child related to me. So for them, it becomes a weighted issue. Yes, I want to give these embryos an opportunity for life, but I also don't want to live with the thought of someone out there raising a child related to me. And so they start to weigh these 2 issues in their mind, and it causes a great deal of angst and trauma. Which of these 2 options would I prefer? The next option is to donate to science, donate to stem cell research or other types of scientific uses. And then a 4th is actually the most common choice that people make for their embryos, which is to do nothing. They keep their embryos in frozen storage indefinitely without a plan. Well, among these options, I think the question then for Protestants is which of those 4 is not only the best but the ethical imperative. Doing nothing is not an option. Donating to science results always in the destruction of that human life. Destroying the embryos is not an ethical option. And so really we're left with only one option from the biblical argument when we recognize the personhood of these embryos. The only option left, given this pro-life argument, is embryo adoption. Let's go to the next slide. As I said, the issue here among scholars is also about stem cell research, and here's a main point where Catholics and Protestants agree, and I guess it's a good place to kind of leave off on this webinar, is that there's a strong place of agreement between Catholics and Protestants. And that area of agreement is not only when it comes to either the pro-life movement or IVF or reproductive technology, it really, in both sides, on how ethics are approached, not as comparative, but as absolute. In other words, I think both Catholics and Protestants agree that we're not trying to compare one good against another good or one evil against another evil. Very few people, and you can see these arguments in the books by John Kilner and David Hager and Paige Cunningham about bioethics, very seldom do you see notable Protestant leaders writing arguments where they're trying to compare, for instance, the good that could come out of embryo research in order to potentially save some lives by developing a new technology, weighed against the death of that embryo that would result if we destroy that embryo. Instead, what we see from scholars on both sides is more of an absolute view, that there it is not justifiable to end one person's life in order to potentially or even certainly save someone else's life. We don't take the lives of embryos in order to potentially give lives through stem cell research to other people. If we make comparative arguments where we say, well, defending the life of embryos may be important, but also giving potential life-saving cures to other people would be more important, that's obviously the type of slippery slope that Catholic scholars have tried to avoid on this whole issue, and I think that Protestant scholars equally are doing the same job of avoiding. In other words, these scholars in the books represented here are able to argue that it's not a slippery slope to allow embryo adoption and IVF, but at the same time, you can still prevent having a comparative ethic where you try to compare the results or the greater good of taking one life in order to give to another. That's the content that I have today, and I assume we have some question and answer time, so let me hand it back to Deb, and she can explain.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan. I will go ahead and open it up for questions. I'm going to leave it on this slide for a little bit, just in case if you need to know how. There's a little box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen that you can enter your questions for. And while I'm waiting, if anybody wants to type those in, I'm also going to let you know about some upcoming webinars that are coming up in January. Oh, that date is wrong. Sorry about that. It's going to be January 4th, I believe, and you can find it on the embryoadoption.org. There's going to be a new webinar called Letting Go of Remaining Embryos, and this is predominantly for families that have the remaining embryos to help them process through and really consider their options as they're looking into possibly donating their embryos. That's going to be a really great webinar, and we're looking forward to it. And then we also have, again in January, sorry about the dates, another embryo donation and adoption open mic night. So that's really great for adoptive families, anybody that's interested, or donating families as well, to join us and just ask whatever question is on their mind, and we will be able to answer it at that point. So I would really recommend checking out embryoadoption.org and going to the webinar section and just looking at the upcoming webinars and registering for those, because they're going to be really great. And then I will go ahead and see if there's any questions coming in. I'm not seeing any so far, but I'll give a couple more minutes. I thought that was a really great webinar, Dan. You explained everything just beautifully, so thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. It doesn't look like any questions are coming in so far, so I might go ahead and close it up a little bit early this morning. I know everybody's got work to get back to. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and we just look forward to having you join us in the future as well. Thank you so much, Dan.
All right. Bye-bye.